I have heard for years how fascinated his students were, and he was probably the most highly regarded professor down there. The students loved him, and we loved him. And so every year that we have a national reunion, we call Dr. Gary Breeze, he will let you know how we Yoders survived in Catawba County as new people here in the United States before we were the United States. I am so very pleased to introduce to you our friend, Dr. Gary Breeze.
Thank you, Rachel. Do I have it right? Sounds okay. Okay. I want to start out with two things. First, I need to tell you I am not a Yoder, but I have known a lot of them through my life, most particularly my great-aunt Grace Ramseur Lippert, whose great-grandfather was George M. Yoder, the chronicler, the historian. So she was a great dear lady to me in my youth. She made me eat rhubarb for the first time when I was 8 years old. I was not ready. I was not trained. And I remember the scorn that she gave me when I did not finish that piece of pie. The second thing is I'm not a genealogist. I'm a historian who takes advantage of genealogy and uses it to my own effect to write local history. Back in 1989, I was contacted by folks here at the museum in Catawba County to write a one-volume history of the county to celebrate its 150th anniversary. I told the biggest lie of my life, and I said, I can do that in 3 years. 25 years later, in 7 volumes, we completed that project, and it's one of my prime achievements of my life that I wrote 3 books called The Catawbans. George Yoder is very important to the first volume of that book because he was the chronicler of early Catawba history for the German side, and the other Yoders, including Fred, were important in the subsequent volumes. So today, I'm going to give you a talk on Conrad Yoder's revolutionary world. Now, Conrad himself will not appear directly in this very often. Conrad, you must remember, was in his 50s when the revolution came to the country, the Carolina backcountry, and it is doubtful that he actually fought in the war, even though my predecessor historian who wrote the book from the 1950s in Catawba County said that he fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain. I can neither confirm nor deny that that happened. Let's pretend it did, so we can family argument. And that's the only particular thing we have with his military service. However, you have in your Yoder newsletter published the 2 receipts which Conrad Yoder received for being a supplier to the continental system, to the state of North Carolina, and the money which he was owed, almost 2,000 pounds in wartime money at that time. So we have to pursue the fact that Conrad was an active patriot, that he was involved in local neighborhood affairs, particularly when the British invaded in the 1780s, and that he was exactly what we think of him as our ancestor. So, with that, I'll go to my third thing to tell you before we really get started. This is a talk that's illustrated about Henry White. Because I don't have particular Conrad things in hand, I simply resurrected an old talk I have using these particular slides from my book, The Catawbans, to illustrate the Revolutionary period. So there'll be a couple times when I'll just skip over that particular one. It doesn't have anything to do with the Yoders, if you will. Conrad was one of the more fortunate North Carolinians, at least from the point of view of heritage, in that he was involved in the establishment of one of North Carolina's few liberty trees. Now, the liberty tree is one of the great symbols of the American Revolution. It helps define essentially what happened in terms of patriot desires and demands in terms of the British Empire. And this is from a Liberty Tree meeting in Pennsylvania before the war itself. North Carolina has no particular statewide tradition of that tree, but yet my research has shown, going back to the 1990s, that Catawba Valley, particularly the South Fork Valley where Conrad lived with the Whiteners and others, that it had a liberty tree that was incredibly important to the history of Catawba County, and I think helps us understand a little bit more about the Yoder character, if you will, the Yoder character. So this is a traditional liberty tree, and this is the tree that Conrad stood under in 1780, perhaps sooner, given when he arrived with Henry Whitener in the 1750s. This is the Whitener oak. It sat on the Whitener plantation, which was about 2 miles north of where Conrad lived, until the 1900s. Does everyone see the tree in the background? This is from a cattle sale meeting in 1914 when they were promoting the dairy industry in Catawba County, which would have included somewhere in that crowd or some Yoders, because they would have been in the neighborhood. But I can't identify which. But that's the Whitener oak. It fell over in 1938. And from around 1750-something, when Conrad and Henry Whitener and others arrived in the South Fork, it had a story to tell, and a story that's very important to our understanding of the heritage. I'm going to start with that story, and then I will get into the actual facts of the Revolution and lead us to a question and answer period where I can elaborate on all the themes that I'm trying to show you. So I'm going to try in this episode, in this talk, to show you what happened, why people were divided over what happened, and then what the long-term legacy is. So we're going to start with the tree and when it was young. This tree clearly dates to somewhere in the early 1700s in terms of its being a sapling, and it was apparently in the front yard of Henry Whitener's first house, which he must have built around 1750 when he and Catherine Mull came down here from getting married in Pennsylvania. Was Conrad part of building the Whitener house? Did Conrad live with the Whiteners? Tradition tends to make us think that's true. And so he would have been involved in the actual construction of this house, and then would have perhaps been living somewhere with them or within the neighborhood itself through the 1750s. Our story that's important to us begins in 1759, when, during the French and Indian War, there is an unexpected attack by the Cherokee Indians on the Catawba River Valley. They strike without warning, and they kill one of the neighbors of Conrad and Henry Whitener. They kill Abram Mull. And Abram Mull is killed in his fields. His child is scalped, according to the family tradition. Mrs. Mull, who was over on another pasture gathering cattle, runs to the site once the Indians leave, notices that her child is barely alive, her husband is dead, and she repairs to Henry Whitener's house as refuge. The Whiteners quickly take refuge in a cave on the South Fork Valley, and then they flee to where Lexington, South Carolina is, the Dutch fort down there, and they wait out the Indian attacks that occur in 1759 and 1760 in the safety of South Carolina. Based upon anything I've read in Fred's book or any other place, we don't know what happened with Conrad during this period. It is perhaps true that Conrad went with the Whiteners. It is perhaps true that Conrad fled to another place. It is even possibly conceivable, although doubtful, that he stayed during these dangerous times. But nevertheless, Henry Whitener was in South Carolina, and as he passed the Catawba Nation, for those of you from out of state, the Catawba Nation was located where south of Charlotte is today, near Rock Hill, South Carolina. Henry Widener and obviously Conrad in association had been friendly to the Catawba Indians during the 1750s. And the Catawba promised that they would keep an eye out on the neighborhood where the Wideners and others lived, and they would be warning anyone to come back that they shouldn't come out into the open if they came and tried to figure out if it was safe to live there anymore at that time. They would paint that oak tree that you see there red, and it would stay red until it was safe to come back. We have at least one episode where Henry Widener comes back. He does not bring Conrad with him, but he is with one of the Wilfonds. The young Wilfond man is killed at that time, and Henry Widener barely escapes with his life. Not until 1762 is it safe to come back, and people began to rebuild their lives in the Catawba Valley. Note that date. Who knows? That's the year that Conrad purchased the land from Henry Widener for his own farmstead. And so there's an association between the actual war, the Cherokee-Anglo War, and what essentially is happening with Conrad in this interregnum, if you will, between the two. The tree is painted white. Then they build a house next to that tree. That's not that house. The house you see is an 1800s house. But Henry Widener's second house, which I think I can get to in just a second. I'm going to skip that. There's the map of the Catawba Valley. And there shows you the area where they were living. This is the general area and what it looked like. This is Baker's Mountain. And I've been told that's Yoder land in the foreground, but I'm not 100% sure that's true. At any rate, they come back and they establish the neighborhood that you think of as part of your heritage. And Henry Widener and Conrad begins his family, others nearby, which you see with the map. That's an early Shuford house. That may be what the Wideners were living in. That clearly is a building that Conrad would have visited at some point because it was in the neighborhood. And we'll skip that. That's the French and Indian War slide. There we go. Those are the land parcels, which is the famous map where Henry Widener, Conrad, and others lived. They lived there in prosperity in the 1760s and established themselves as grain farmers, as herders, and as general purpose farmers for that period. I dare say that somebody somewhere had a still, because turning it into alcohol was the best investment for your brain. And this became essentially the product of a small community that Conrad was an integral part of. Into this place comes tension. And let me explain one of the tensions that Conrad faced that is often overlooked when you study the American Revolution. North Carolina was the worst colony of the 13th. They used to talk about how terrible poor Carolina was. South Carolina was the richest colony because of rice and slavery. But North Carolina tended to be a poor, backward, and terribly governed colony. And one of the things which it could not get straight was land tenure, the ownership of land. An aristocrat in England, Lord Granville, during the 1740s and the 1750s, owned the northern half of North Carolina. And to settle here, you had to get a grant from Lord Granville. It's called Granville Grants. The Granville District, as it was called, was surveyed all the way to the Catawba River by the 1750s. It was not surveyed past the Catawba River. And what was uncertain was whether people who lived on the west side of the Catawba River, that's here, if you don't know, actually should get their land directly from the crown, that is, from the governor in the colony's capital, or whether they should get their land directly from Lord Granville. Most of the land grants in the area around where Henry Whitener lived were granted by the governor of North Carolina in the 1750s and into the 1760s. That may not have ever stood up in court had it been challenged by Granville and his heirs. One of the people to acquire that land was Henry Whitener from the crown with his land grant of 1750. And so one of the things that is a background study, that I'll come back to in just a little bit, is the fact that what Conrad bought may not have been his. Or at least there could have been a difficulty later with who actually had the tenure on the land. Now, in reality, Lord Granville died and these challenges were never met. But that didn't mean that it wouldn't impact what happened in the American Revolution. So keep that thought in mind as we go further into the study. That's Henry Whitener's powder horn according to tradition. We assume Conrad would have had one similar, perhaps as decorated, perhaps not. Along comes the American Revolution. I'll let you know that, it was over conflict with trade, with regulation, and of course the famous phrase, no taxation without representation. North Carolina had been roiled. It had been split apart over many of these issues because North Carolina's tax system was unfair and because many of its local officials, when they took land tenure titles at the county courthouse, were often accused of extortion, meaning they would only give you the land title if you paid them a little bit up front and a little bit to the side, if you will. So North Carolina was divided severely by a taxpayer protest movement called the Regulation. It began in the mid-1760s. It climaxes in 1771 when a group of citizens called the Regulators attempt to march on the capital of North Carolina and are put down by militia forces from the eastern part of the colony. This was a predecessor to the Revolution, and this was also part of the whole conflict which North Carolina was involved with. We have nothing to tell us if people here were involved in the regulation. There are no instances of meetings, there are no protests which we have any kind of record on, and what we do have in terms of Rowan County records, where this area was located in Rowan County at that time, that we have no records that there was anyone here who was a regulator. Most regulators seem to have lived up in what is the Greensboro area, if you will, where they were having the most corruption. So we assume, in part because these folks spoke German and they lived off to themselves, and because Henry Whitener was their leader and he was well respected by colonial officials, that the regulation itself did not affect this area. But it divided North Carolina. And it meant that North Carolinians were angry at each other at the time the American Revolution starts in 1775. Well, what did that mean? Well, it meant that significant numbers of North Carolinians chose to be loyalists during the Revolution. In particular, they chose to be loyalists down around the Cape Fear area where Fayetteville is today. They were numerous in the area around Greensboro, where the Regulators had been, and they tended to be scattered across the foothills, the mountain area just to the west of here, because many of the Regulators had fled to the mountains after the regulation ended sabbatic, when it was suppressed. What that meant was there was no particular knowledge who was loyal and who wasn't. Moreover, the people who took over the state, once they created the state of North Carolina, tended to be from two distinct groups, the English from the east and the Scots-Irish from the west, particularly in the area around Charlotte and Salisbury. And fundamentally, they distrusted anyone who wasn't them. Well, that included who? People who lived on the Catawba Valley who spoke what? Spoke German and kept to themselves, and nobody knew particularly what their loyalty was. In 1777, the state of North Carolina passed a loyalty oath, and Henry Whitener and several Germans from here were summoned to the courthouse in Salisbury to testify to their loyalty. We have no particular data if Conrad was one of those people, but we do know that they certified that they were loyal to the Patriot cause. We also assume, but don't know, that by 1777, Henry Whitener Jr., who had been elected the militia captain for the particular South Fork area where the Whiteners and the Yoders lived, would begin military duty, particularly in South Carolina, where many North Carolina units were sent to suppress Tories. There's also one legend that in 1776, some patriots from here marched towards Moores Creek to suppress the Tories at the Battle of the Moores Creek Bridge. Again, that's folklore, we can't be sure. But what we know is that there was division within the neighborhood from the very beginning. There is a local tradition that a young man, Isaac Wise, was hanged by Tories in the early part of the Revolution, very near to here in Newton, for his openly loyal, for his open patriotism, so to speak, his openness to the cause. But not much else was happening. So you must understand that for Conrad, in his 50s, with an established family, not a lot is occurring other than political turmoil elsewhere for the first several years of the Revolution, from roughly 1776 to 1779. The Revolution, particularly the War for Independence, was something which was far off. The only exception to that occurred in 1776 when Rowan militia, including militia from here, marched into the mountains of North Carolina and desecrated the Cherokee villages that were in the western portion of what is our state today. This was called the Rutherford Expedition. They destroyed the orchards, they destroyed the fields, they destroyed the houses, and decimated Cherokee society for several years. So what we have is not a lot of knowledge of what Conrad would have known, what he would have been involved in, until the British invade South Carolina in 1779. We know that North Carolina militia, particularly militia from Rowan County, marched south with some of the American commanders to fight the British. They were involved peripherally with the battles down there, but we aren't sure if the actual militia company from here was involved with it as well. What we do know is that when the British led to the conquering of Savannah first in 1779, and then in 1780 when the British conquered Charlestown, when Charlestown surrendered with an entire American army to lay down its arms, that's when the revolution began for Conrad and his neighbors. Soon after the fall of Charlestown, a man who had grown up here named John Moore, who had achieved a commission as a captain in an American provincial army. That meant Tories. That meant Tories who joined the British Army as a special unit. He appears here. And begins to recruit people to join that provincial army and fight for the British. He holds rallies throughout this area, which indicates, according to George Yoder's chronicles, that there was a tremendous number of people who were at most neutral or at worst disloyal to the Patriot cause in the general area of the Catawba Valley. That's when we think the great meeting occurred. I'm going to go back, if you will. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Please forgive me. I want to get us back to the tree.
Let me explain. See, you had a decision to make in the summer of 1780. Were you going to acquiesce to the British invasion? The biggest city in the area had fallen. The American army was gone. And the British were basically organizing the two Carolinas to the benefit of the crown. And John Moore was putting pressure upon people with coercion to get them to basically come around and come to the British side. Now remember, Henry Whitener had already acknowledged that he was loyal to the Patriot cause back in 1777. And one family tradition suggests that he was the first person here to actually declare his patriotism when John Moore came. That he, in a sense, stood up to Moore and said he would have nothing to do with the Tory cause. Well, we have to assume, given that Conrad was his protege, so to speak, that Conrad would have been one of those people who stood with him. Now, according to George Yoder and others from the Whitener legacy, they met to decide what to do under that tree. That tree had become the symbol, if you will, or else it was just a hot day and it needed shade. I can't tell you which. And they made a decision that day that the neighborhood would be for the patriots. That the neighborhood would be for the patriots. And that they would stand firm for the cause of liberty and for independence. George Yoder essentially assumed that this became known as the Catawba Covenant, an agreement. And we have to assume that one of the people there was, of course, Conrad. That Conrad would have been integral to this meeting, that for all indications he was, of course, in agreement, and that this was basically a stand they took against the danger that if the Tories invaded that area, they could come and take their land, they could come and take their property. Because remember, their property tenure was in jeopardy, right? If the king won, for all you knew in North Carolina, the king could decide who got to keep the land when the war was over. It wasn't like other places where, in a sense, common law and British tradition would have secured the land. But they were literally gambling their legacy and their land in that day. Now, based upon what we have a story that now ties us to the Yoders. And that is that John Yoder, the son of Conrad, who was 16 at that time, came to this meeting and he volunteered to fight. But he was told that day, according to family tradition, that he was too young and that he needed to go home and eat some pots of mush to bulk up to be ready to fight. He must have been slender, is my guess. So he was not chosen that day. Now, what happens next is that these volunteers march off with Henry Whitener Jr., who's the militia captain, to the Battle of Ramseur's Mill. And Ramseur's Mill was fought in June of 1780, and it was the rebellion against the rebellion of the Tories. Everybody get that? It was a counter-rebellion, if you will, of what the Tories were trying to do. More than 1,000 Tories had gathered. More than 1,000 Tories had gathered at Ramseur's Mill, where the town of Lincoln is today, to begin the march to South Carolina to fight for the British. In turn, Scots-Irish militia from Rowan and Mecklenburg counties had marched across the river from the Charlotte area and took up a surprise attack, which led to more than an hour battle where over 55 people were killed and 200 were wounded, often people who were shooting each other who were neighbors, and often who were trying to settle personal vendettas as they were going about this battle. The battle ended in the favor of the Whigs, that is, the Patriots. The Tories were scattered. More than a third of them did not have guns yet, because they were obviously too poor to own their own guns, and they were waiting for the British to supply them. And this battle scattered the Tory sentiment across the neighborhoods of the area of the Catawba Valley, the Broad River Valley, and the basic part of the western part of North Carolina. So this covenant won this first battle. Then came the second invasion in the fall of 1780 when Major Ferguson marched into North Carolina to demand loyalty from its inhabitants, to basically do the same thing that Moore had done. And once again, patriots gathered together, particularly men from across the mountains. They were known as the Upper Mountain Men, and they marched to end the invasion, and that led to the Battle of Kings Mountain. Again, the story of the Covenant Oak often confuses the Battle of Ramsar's Mill with the Battle of Kings Mountain. It's often said that John Yoder volunteered to go to Kings Mountain. That could be true, but we don't know which battle they actually were meeting before. But my logic suggests that Ramsar's Mill was the key decision, and after that, these people were committed to the Patriot cause. Off marched Henry Widener's men. They're part of the German regiment under Frederick Hambright. They fight at Kings Mountain at the steepest part of the mountain that they have to climb and assault the Tories there. And according to legend, one of the sons of Henry Widener, Daniel, fires the shot that kills Major Ferguson, the Tory commander. That can't be confirmed. If you go to Kings Mountain and you actually had a park ranger's ask, they don't know who killed Ferguson. They assume that multiple shots entered his body almost simultaneously, but yet young Widener came back and he said that he saw when he shot that Ferguson fell off the horse. Again, if there were simultaneous shots, it's hard to tell. But nevertheless, one of our local legends is that we killed the commander at Kings Mountain. And so that was the second blow which they did. Again, remember that the 1950s book claims that Conrad went along and he was part of that force. Again, I can't prove to you either way about that. So the two British invasions are stymied. Then comes the third British invasion in early 1781, when Lord Cornwallis himself, with the main British army, marches through essentially the Catawba Valley, past Ramsar's Mill, and crosses the Catawba at Cowan's Ford, south of here, and then enters into the heart of North Carolina, which leads to an invasion that takes him eventually to Yorktown. There are stories about Catawba men, no Yoders are mentioned, who were present at Cowan's Ford, and they could have been part of that whole system, if you will, of defense for everything. However, once Cornwallis leaves, disorder is the name of the game for the next several months. For much of 1781, there's hardly any Whig or Patriot presence that is organized, and we devolve into a kind of civil war. That leads to stories, again, we don't have a Yoder story, but we have a Widener story, that Tories came up and hung up Henry Widener by his joints and tried to beat out of him the knowledge of where he hid his money. His wife, Catherine, blew a conch shell which alerted the neighbors to the fact that Tories were in the vicinity, and they gave chase to the Tories, but the Tories escaped. There are other stories of other men being harassed for their money, and there are many stories of pilfering and sabotage and horse thievery in this period. The best one is at the house of George Wilfong, nearby, that they came up, ransacked the house when George was gone. His wife was there. They left. They used her clothesline to bridle the horses. They fled. The people were rallied by another conch shell sound. They gave chase. They found them in the edge of the foothills, and they hanged them with those clotheslines. So as you can tell, things got out of hand quite visibly. That's the period that period in 1781, when Conrad is noted for bringing supplies to the Patriot cause. It's 1781 that his receipts are there. Well, what does that mean? That means in the face of great danger from having your homestead burned, torched, hung up by your feet, whatever, that Conrad stood firm for independence. He did not waver. That's what those receipts tell us that we learn and know about Conrad's involvement with the war. I think it's even possible by that time John had eaten enough pots of mush that he too could have participated in the war itself too. By 1782, the Tory War, the Tory phase of the war had ended, and fundamentally you had an end to hostilities. But that didn't mean that the legacy died. That tree came to symbolize the unity of the neighborhood where Conrad lived. And what that would mean is that they would band together and stay together politically throughout the 1800s. They tended to vote for Democrats, they were Jeffersonians, and they were people who essentially wanted to be left alone to live their life in the way they had chosen. This unity does not fall apart until the 1890s, a century after Conrad died. And George Yoder, who's writing at that time, the historian, remarks upon the fact that Yoders had been united until the populist movement came along, and that several Yoders had decided to become populists and turned their backs on the Democratic Party over the economic issues of the 1890s. Yoder deplored this, and there are several columns he writes for the Newton papers over the fact that essentially a century-old tradition has been destroyed. The fact that it lasted a century, to conclude, is to testify with the resolution and the resolve, if you will, of Yoders and their neighbors that the revolution taught them. We must band together or we will hang separately. I'll end here and let you ask me questions. Go off in new directions. I got those glasses on so I can see. Sorry, I see a hand way back there.
Early in the battle that you just went through, you said they had no weapons.
The Tories had no weapons. As far as we know, the Patriots were all armed.
Okay, with what is, how do you fight, how did they fight it?
Oh, all the Tories who didn't have arms ran away at the very beginning of the battle. I didn't say that.
Well, they ran away.
Yes.
And were any of them, it was a Mennonite connection earlier in all this fight, were any of them anti-war, you know?
We don't have evidence to know that. Yeah. Hey.
In terms of the Catawba covenant, you mentioned that it was assumed that Conrad was there along with other members. I'm assuming from the fact that it was an assumption, is that there is no declaration or document or nothing that was signed that day.
To our knowledge, there was no document. This was all an oral agreement. George Yoder alludes to it in a way that makes it seem like they basically had a decision: are we going to be Whigs or are we going to be Tories? They determined they would be Whigs, and that set up a tradition that they would band together later. We assumed when they would meet to politic, and we assumed in their attitudes towards, towards the future developments in the country. Now, to help you understand that, nearby lived the Schuberts. And the Schuberts, who become so famous and so rich in hickory, they were Tories. So there were Tories in the neighborhood that we assumed Schuberts were not there that day, or else they left in disagreement.
One more follow-up question about the significance of Ramsauer's mill.
Yes.
Following that battle, was it the case in North Carolina that you no longer, even though you had these incidents happening all over between Tories and Whigs, that what you did not have was organized Tory militia that Cornwallis could scoop up on his way?
Samuel Bryan, who led the Tories in what is Dayton County today, was still organized after Ramsey's Mill, and there was a skirmish with him that's often overlooked where he was defeated as well. So yes, the answer is true, that after that, there was never organized Tory resistance. It evolved into decentralized guerrilla warfare.
Is it fair to say that that lack of organization contributed significantly to the final outcome of the revolution?
Oh, absolutely. You can always make the argument that Ramsey's Mill is the overlooked turning point. Sure, a small battle that had big implications for what happened when the British marched through the state. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
I was listening to a YouTube video about the Kings Mountain battle.
Yes.
And one of the things they said in the video was that in order to distinguish the Patriots from the Tories, or from the Patriots from the Loyalists put twigs in their hats.
Pine twigs usually.
Is that true?
Yes.
And then the Patriots would wear something white.
They wear a piece of white paper.
Yes.
That's right. Because they were dressed alike. You couldn't tell the difference. That was one of the problems with Ramsey's Mill. We're not really sure if they had the headgear, but people got very confused as to who was on whose side, especially since they were people from your neighborhood. And there are stories from Ramsey's Mill of people seeking out revenge from past injustices or past troubles. I can't tell you they wore them at Ramsey's Mill, but I am sure at Kings Mountain, those guys had little white pieces of paper. Now, where they got the paper? Somebody always asks me where they got the paper. I have no idea. Yeah, I don't know. Anyone else? Yes.
Well, one of Heinrich Weidner's sons died.
Yes, I neglected to mention that one of the sons died and the other one supposedly shot for us.
In which battle?
Kings Mountain.
Kings Mountain.
I get them mixed up. Abram and Dan.
Abraham, I think, died.
Abram died.
And then there was also a relative who came from Dellinger who had been involved in his daughter, by a Weidner wife, married Conrad's son Jacob and moved to Indiana. And he was really involved up front. I think, Trion resolves that were.
Yes, I didn't get into those because I didn't know Conrad had a direct.
He signed that Jacob did. So I think that was even earlier than some of these battles.
Yes. Let me, and I'll take a question in just a minute. This picture was taken in the 1920s. That's what the tree looked like by that time. So to understand how this legacy lived, Hickory had a local heritage pageant in the 1920s. They were very popular throughout the nation to celebrate your heritage. And the story they told was the story of Henry Widener and his oak tree. So this was an alive story that people told over and over again in ways that other places there's nothing like this. There is something called the Tory Oak in Wilkesboro, but it doesn't have stories other than that Benjamin Cleveland hanged Tories there. So it doesn't have the oomph, if you will. And let me get sort of towards the end. Again, that Henry Widener, this is Ephrata. Emily mentioned it. And Henry Widener's mother lived there. That's why that's there. Remember again that the trails led to where Conrad and Henry Widener lived, that they were one of the westernmost settlers in the colonies at that time. This is just another version of the map, Baker's Mountain, you see. Again, this is the Shuford House according to tradition. For all we know, this is what Conrad knew when he got there, this kind of house. Why else would you have done it? And it was built over a spring. You see, it's got a stone foundation for a whole story, and then it's basically a story and a half above that. Now, this hasn't survived. This is from a picture of the early 1900s. That's just my French Navy War illustration. And there is Patrick Ferguson being shot at the Battle of Kings Mountain, one of the famous paintings of the Revolution. And Henry and Catherine's tombstone. And then this is the house that's in the picture. And these are some of the people who carried on the tradition. This is John W. Robinson and his wife, and suddenly her first name escapes me. Maud, no, that's not right. Well, anyway, her father was R.A. Yoder, the founder of the or rhyme and drawer of the map. So these stories are in part kept alive, if you will, by Yoders and others who were part of their neighbors to begin with. I think that's the last one. That's what the tree looked when they cut it. It fell over, they chopped it up. I am told that some whiteners still have pieces of it, but they've never shown it to me.
Is there some sort of marker or monument
No.
there? No.
No, you wouldn't know any of this is true.
Did you say that with Conrad picture there of that tree?
No. That's a Whitener. I think that's Paul Whitener, the artist, but I can't prove it. And then if you go downstairs today, one of the legacies of my research is that the museum built me a Whitener tree. I don't know if Conrad's on it or not. Never read them all. Any other questions? I'm sorry, I cut that off. Yes, ma'am.
Any of the contingent of the Patriots in the area go north and join up in Washington?
I have fretted over that and don't know the answer. There is one legend about a Howe who joined the Continental Forces, but I don't know. Local history is very hard to figure out who joined the Continental Army in Western North Carolina. It just doesn't, unless you get a pension. You know, we're all contingent upon pension plans that were filed in the 1830s, and almost every one of those are militia. You know, I was drafted in militia, and I went off against the Tories, and I served under Captain Whitener, which is why they know he was down. Anyone else? Well, I do believe it's lunchtime. I'll turn it over to you.